We all understand the concept of a prison and probably what it's like to feel vulnerable, but are you aware that in some prison systems around the world, prisoners have to be protected because they're at risk of attack or assault? There's no worldwide definition of vulnerability or rigid international criteria for why we should protect prisoners, but typically those who've been convicted of sexual offences or offences against children have to be segregated. It's not as straightforward as this, however, because there's a category of non-offence protection prisoners, and this might be somebody who's a first-time prisoner, an ex-police officer, somebody who's got themselves into debt within the institution. Vulnerability is not a straightforward, homogeneous concept, therefore, because people become vulnerable for many different reasons at different times. Excuse me. The research problem that I've identified is that vulnerability is not well understood, and neither is its management. There's a current lack of staff resources in the prison system at present, which means that vulnerable prisoners are not being identified, and the regime within protective custody is poor and sometimes even more dangerous than mainstream prisons, thus rendering the idea of protection illegitimate. My focus is on Scotland and England, and thankfully there's a duty of care to all prisoners which is enshrined in legislation. The aims and objectives of my research are to understand more about the way that Scotland and England conceptualise vulnerability. I also want to learn more about how prison staff assess and identify potentially vulnerable prisoners. I'd like to know more about the decision-making process of prisoners who request protection, and I'd also like to study the regime further. I believe that my research has the potential for real-world impact to improve the identification of and the support provided to vulnerable prisoners. I'm going to adopt a mixed methods approach, basically incorporating interviews, documentary analysis and focus groups. I'm currently in the process of requesting research access to the Scottish Prison Service in Edinburgh and to the Ministry of Justice in London. I'd like to access 2 prisons in Scotland and 2 prisons in England, both of a similar size, to provide a good comparison. Excuse me. Obviously, it's an ethically sensitive area, and so this is an important issue. The reason why my research is important is because there's a massive gap in the academic literature, but more importantly, vulnerable prisoners are not being cared for at present. In 2016, the suicide levels in English prisons were the highest ever recorded, and arguably some of those who'd been put into protection could have been saved. This research is also important not just to vulnerable prisoners and to staff, but also to the families, to the taxpayer, and to preventing future victims. I'm sure everybody in this room is thoroughly law-abiding, but if you were ever sent to prison, would you know how to request protection? Would you do so, and what standards of care would you expect to receive? Thank you.